Welcome to The Explainer, where we really dig into the source material behind big ideas. All right, let's get right into it.
So here's a real head-scratcher. How can a global superpower win pretty much every single battle and still end up losing the war? I mean, it sounds impossible, right? But that's exactly what happened to the United States in Vietnam. It's this paradox that completely changed how people thought about warfare, and it's still studied today.
You're talking about a conflict that spanned more than a decade. The U.S. threw a massive amount of military power at it. At one point, you had over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. But even with all that power, a decisive win just never materialized. In the end, they had to pull out in what was diplomatically called an honorable withdrawal. So to figure out how this could happen, we need to think outside the box a little, or maybe way, way back in the box. The answer to this very modern puzzle might just be hiding in a text that's about 2,500 years old, Sun Tzu's The Art of War.
Sun Tzu didn't mince words on this. He was all about offensive campaigns, and his #1 rule was speed. Speed is critical. He flat out said that no country has ever benefited from a long, dragged-out war. So, that's a big question, right? Why is a long war so incredibly dangerous?
And he was super specific about it. He laid out these 3 distinct failures, a kind of domino effect that happens every time a war drags on too long.
Okay, so first, your army starts to fall apart. The troops get exhausted, morale just hits rock bottom. Think of it like their swords getting dull and their spirits just breaking. Then, the simple act of trying to attack fortified places just sucks the life out of your military. And that brings us to the third and, really critical stage. Because when your military is spent and your bank account is empty, you're a sitting duck. Other countries, your rivals, they're going to see that weakness and they will pounce. Sun Tzu's warning was pretty stark. Once you get to that point, it doesn't matter how smart your leaders are. The situation is just unsalvageable. So let's connect the dots. How does this ancient theory play out in the real world, specifically in Vietnam?
It's almost spooky, really. When you look at what happened in Vietnam, it's like a textbook example, a tragic one, of everything Sun Tzu warned against. The parallels are just undeniable. And the numbers, well, they tell the story.
First up, let's talk about the human toll of just keeping a war going for that long. We're talking more than 2.5 million Americans sent over there. A lot of them were just cycling through a conflict that had no clear finish line. It's a huge strain. And then, of course, there's the heartbreaking loss of life. 58,000 Americans killed. Each one of those deaths chipped away at support for the war back home, eventually sparking a massive anti-war movement. And the sheer amount of stuff used, it's just mind-boggling. The U.S. expended 3 times more ammo in Vietnam than in all of World War II. Think about that. That is an insane drain on your military resources. It's exactly what Sun Tzu was talking about. And finally, you follow the money. The national treasury was just being bled dry. The cost was enormous, hundreds of billions of dollars, which put a massive, massive strain on the entire U.S. economy.
And you can see the impact right here on the economy. All that spending basically brought a booming economy to a screeching halt. By 1970, growth flatlined. And of course, that economic pain just poured gasoline on the fire of social unrest. Yet protests everywhere, people fleeing the country to avoid the draft, it was a mess.
So after it was all over, American strategists did a lot of soul-searching. And you know where they turned? Sun Tzu. They started looking at their own mistakes through his ancient framework, and they realized they'd made a huge fundamental miscalculation.
A strategist named John Collins really hit the nail on the head. He pointed out that the U.S. totally ignored one of Sun Tzu's most important rules: attack the enemy's strategy, not just their army. America was so focused on winning individual firefights that they completely missed the bigger picture. They weren't fighting a conventional war, they were fighting a revolutionary one.
And get this, this is maybe the most powerful piece of evidence. The actual commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, he later quoted Sun Tzu directly when he looked back on the war. He flat out admitted that getting sucked into a long war in that terrain, the jungles and mountains that basically made American tanks and heavy firepower useless, was one of the biggest mistakes the country ever made. So the lessons from Vietnam were incredibly painful, but they were learned. And these lessons, which Sun Tzu had laid out centuries earlier, completely changed the way the U.S. military thought about war.
From that point on, you see a major shift.
In the wars that came later, the #1 priority for the U.S. military became avoiding long, drawn-out fights. The new playbook was all about quick strike, quick withdrawal. Get in, hit hard and fast with overwhelming force, and then get out.
It really all comes back to this one powerful idea that the U.S. had to learn the hard way. A fast victory, even a messy or clumsy one, is way, way better than a skillful war that just drags on forever, draining the country of its people, its money, and its will to fight.
And that brings us right back to the present day, doesn't it? This piece of wisdom, 2,500 years old, is still a super critical question for leaders everywhere, not just in the military, but in business, in politics, you name it. I guess the big takeaway here is that technology, weapons, politics, all that stuff changes. But some core truths about strategy, they seem to be absolutely timeless.